Hey everyone! Welcome back to another Planet Zoo tutorial video. Before we jump in, I just wanted to thank everyone for the overwhelming love and support given towards my previous video. It really means a lot to me that I'm able to share my passion for Planet Zoo with y'all and give you some helpful tips along the way that will hopefully help you enjoy the game as much as I do. I read through the comments on my previous video and talked to a bunch of you during my live streams and decided to make this video about terraforming. I get so many questions about how to use the terrain tool properly because, let's be honest, it's a very complex tool and it can take some time to get used to it. I feel like every day I find a new way to use the tool to improve upon my methods of terraforming, so essentially my biggest tip is to keep experimenting. I'll be walking y'all through my thought process as I'm working on each terraforming project, so hopefully it will help you guys understand what I'm thinking when I'm terraforming. Don't forget to leave a comment on what kind of video you'd like to see next. I always have trouble deciding what I want to make. Please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy this video because I take your feedback seriously. Oh, and one last thing before we get started, I'm working on a very unique project during my Twitch live streams. The only way I can describe it is that I basically have a bunch of floating glass biodomes, each with their own ecosystem inside. It's kind of crazy and wild. If you want to see it in person, please be sure to stop by my stream at twitch.tv/Rochella, or you can check out my Twitter and Instagram to see some progress pictures. Thanks again. Now, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, really quick, you guys need to open your settings and then click on Game and enable the disable terrain collision. Make sure you have that checked because it allows you to manipulate your terrain through other objects and it just makes it a lot easier to use. This is very important if you want your terraforming to be very smooth and clean like the way I do it. Alright, first things first, let's go over each little setting for terraforming. Size and intensity will allow you to adjust how much of the terrain you're affecting with each tool. This is the extruding tool. It allows you to create masses of land or add on to where land isn't. So think about using this when you want to create like a mountain or a hill or expand the land. This next tool does the opposite. It takes away land mass. So you can use it to create valleys, ravines, or even caves like I'm going to show you later on. This is the tool I use to make my pit exhibits, just like the one you saw in my previous video. This tool is the flatten to foundation tool, and it's pretty self-explanatory, but it's a little more intricate. Changing the size will change how much of the land gets flattened underneath it. So with this small brush here, it's not completely flattening the land underneath, and it kind of makes a ledge, which can be used to make some really cool structures. Again, if the brush is smaller than what you used to create a hole or a mountain, it will not be able to flatten the entire thing. So we have to make the brush larger in order to fill this hole entirely in. You can see it works both ways because we can also flatten the mountain. The flattening happens from the point of elevation in which you first click, so if you lift up your mouse, you'll lose that point. The next tool on our list is the flatten to surface tool. I don't tend to use this one very often because it's kind of difficult to use. This is another one where you have to hold down the mouse button, otherwise you will lose that point of flattening. And I find that even if I click exactly in the same spot where I left off, it changes the elevation a little bit. So I use this mainly to make very specific structures such as shards of earth jutting out of the ground to flatten a sheer cliffside, or an attempt to flatten the ground in order to place a path, but again, it's a little bit more difficult to use. Alright, I'm gonna be honest here, I never used the chisel tool until this video, so it took me a minute to figure out what its purpose was, because I tend to use a combination of different tools to achieve the thing that chiseling does. So apparently it will flatten a surface kind of. If you make the chisel smaller than the surface you're working with, it just basically presses into the ground. This is cool and all, but I have a different method of doing this with two different tools. I use the pull tool and the flatten tool to achieve this kind of sunken, sharp edge look. Here's an example. You just push the earth in and then flatten it, and it looks exactly the same. I don't know. I just prefer this more. Alright, now this is the smoothing tool. I use this a lot. First of all, this is an example of how it can take away land, because technically it's removing vertex points in order to smoothen the terrain. So if you have a floating island of land that you don't want, you could slowly smooth it away to nothingness. So you kind of have to be very careful. I tend to tap very quickly when using the smoothing tool on large mountains or structures that I make. This is the roughing terrain tool. I literally never use this. I prefer to manually make small hills and valleys myself, but I'll use it as an example to show you what the smoothing tool is capable of. So you can kind of see the shadows getting less and less, and the extreme heights of this rough area smoothing out a little bit, and this just kind of makes it look overall a little bit more natural depending on what you're going for. Finally, I'm going to show you guys that you cannot terraform if there's water nearby. So the terrain will form around the water. It will not collide with the water's mesh. So you have to be very careful if you're wanting to make a smooth entranceway into a river or a pond. You will have to do it without the water in there initially. Otherwise, you won't be able to get the look you're going for. And that's all with the terrain tools. So let's go ahead and get into some actual terraforming builds. So the first structure we're going to be terraforming is going to be a plateau. You guys might be wondering why I'm placing that random decorative African asset. That's actually the exact height of a guest, so I use that to scale my builds. It's very handy if you don't have any reference points around. First and foremost, I terraformed using the pole tool, and I made sure to create a shape that is unnatural and not circular. That's very important. You don't want it to look man-made in this case. Now I'm going around and smoothing the edges because you can see some triangulation happening, and I just don't want those rough shadows. It makes it look nicer. Very carefully, I'm adding more layers by making the brush smaller each time and then going around and smoothing the edges once more. And I wanted to create a little pathway in between here that could be used by a guest, so that's why I added two separate peaks. It also just creates a nice visual sightline for the eye, and once again makes it look a little bit more natural. So you could have a cool guest path going through here. It adds no real value to your zoo other than just looking nice, and hey, that's what I'm all about. The next structure we're going to work on terraforming is going to be a river running into a lake. So we're going to start with the push tool here and kind of just get an indentation in the ground, and then select the flatten tool to go ahead and carve out our riverbed. Now I want to make sure you guys can see that the water level here is kind of ugly, and it's nice to have a natural flow coming out of the river making it look smooth, but it was just way too shallow there and it looked really fake. So we're now going around and kind of using the flattening and the push tool to add in some very nice divots, because varying depth in a river makes it look way more realistic. So I'm doing light clicking here. I'm not holding the mouse for more than a second when I'm pushing the earth around. Otherwise, you might get some extreme edges and stuff that you don't really want to deal with. Now, I'm going through and testing the water level every once in a while here just to make sure that it still looks good. It's important to go in and test these things instead of just waiting till the end of your build to see if you're happy with it. And I'm looking here now and realizing that a lot of the riverbank is too high and it looks kind of weird, so I'm going through and smoothing out some natural areas where maybe an animal could slide into the water. You have to remember that some animals can't get over rough terrain, so you have to accommodate for them. Moving on to making a cave. I'm going to show you guys how not to make a cave first, so watch closely. A lot of people end up using the push and pull tool, but their caves end up looking too chunky and not enough room inside for the animals. So instead of using the push and pull tool only to create your cave, try using the flattening terrain tool like this. It will create a nice flat entrance that the animals are able to walk in. And then once you get further into the cave, you can lower the terrain a little bit to make it look a little more realistic. In this cave, I have it going around the corner so that you can't actually see the back of the cave. It creates more of a cave-like illusion. And now I'm smoothing around the entrance and making it look a little more natural. The important thing with caves though is I don't think they look right unless you have rocks placed around them. And I know how much you guys love rocks, so please enjoy this hectic rock placing. Again, it was very rushed, but I'm going to show you guys how good it looks to have a natural rock face around and how easy it is to place it. I'll kind of walk you through my thought process when placing rocks because I tend to just silently do it when I'm streaming, but I want to have this nice kind of teepee look to the front here, and then I go around and build a base for the rocks at the bottom. So I have this nice flat rocks, and then I slowly build up to some higher rocks to create a little bit more height. It's important to have a variation in rocks depending on what kind of rock builds you're going for. It's a little known fact, but different rock formations call for different rocks. You shouldn't be using the same kind of random rock placement over and over again if you want to get a realistic rock look. So I'm kind of going for a staggered cliff formation here. I will not be using the align to surface tool because that tends to create an effect that looks more like a pile of rocks. So instead, I'm having rocks jutting into the earth to create this very sharp effect, and then going over with some layers and detail to add more texture. For this type of formation, the more edges and shadows, the better. Oh boy, I've been getting requests on how to terraform a mountain since I made one in my Arctic zoo. So let me guys show you what I do. I start by creating a base. I make it pretty tall, and then I tend to move the earth around by clicking very rapidly and just spreading it out. This will allow for a smooth slope when we go over it with the smoothing tool. Now make sure when you're making a mountain, you create a shape that is, again, not symmetrical, because that's not what mountains look like. Now moving on to the second layer, I have it positioned towards the back because I want the front of my mountain to have a very sharp cliff face. We're kind of going around creating varying levels of terrain. Think of it like making a cake. You always start at the bottom and then add layers on top. But in this case, we're smushing the cake down and making it mesh better. So here I have the point of the mountain, and I'm positioning it towards the back because I'm trying to make it asymmetrical. And the point is obviously the smallest part. I'm clicking rapidly again, flattening the terrain, and I know it looks very square and pixeled, but look how nice it looks when we go over it with the smoothing tool. I still want a lot of the shadows to be there though, because mountains are rough. So I'm not completely smoothing it, I'm just lightly tapping it. After smoothing the mountain, I noticed that something was missing. I think it would look nice to have another smaller peak here, so I'm just expanding the terrain off of what I already have. Don't be afraid to go over it again. And if you don't know if your mountain looks good, you should try using a reference image. I based my first mountain off of the dueling peaks from Breath of the Wild. Using references will help you learn and get a better idea of what looks good and natural. And there we have it, a nice mountain. Thanks for watching. Please leave a comment on what video you'd like to see me make next. Also, thank you for 100 subs. See y'all next time!